Welcome back to Sip and Talk, and I am definitely ready to get into some pretty serious global geopolitics today.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. And yeah, this topic, it really demands our full attention. We're wrestling with, I think, one of the most critical structural questions of the 21st century.
Absolutely. So welcome, Sip and Talkers. We are starting this whole discussion today, not in Washington, not in Beijing, but in Singapore. Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, he recently made this observation that just it hits you right in the gut. He said, history has never been kind to small countries.
It's just such a blunt existential truth, isn't it? And it's the kind of thing only a small state that's, living in a geopolitical hotspot can really say out loud.
Right.
For Singapore, and really for all of Southeast Asia, history isn't some abstract thing in a book. They know their region has been, historically, a really cruel arena for proxy wars. They've always been forced to kind of bend to the whims and the conflicts of much larger powers. It's an anxiety that I think never really goes away for them.
And that anxiety, it actually goes way back for Singapore. I remember reading that the PM himself referenced this cautionary tale. It's about a literal ghost town in Michigan in the U.S. that was also called Singapore.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was this thriving lumber and port town in the 19th century, built on all these ideals of trade. But within 50 years, shifting sands, economic changes, it just completely buried the town. And the PM uses this story as a constant, terrifying reminder that, permanence is an illusion. Survival requires this relentless pragmatism.
That's a really powerful metaphor for their daily struggle. And this fear, it leads to the central plea he's making to the major powers, which is, it's the core tension of our conversation today. He's urging giants like China and Japan to put history aside.
Just put it aside for the sake of regional and global stability.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing, the really fascinating part, is that Singapore and the rest of Asia have, against all odds, they've actually managed to do this with Japan.
Yeah, exactly. Despite the unspeakable brutality and the trauma of World War II, through decades of engagement, aid, generational change, and let's be honest, probably necessity, polls consistently show that Japan is now the most trusted great power in the entire region.
Wow.
They've achieved a genuine forward-looking political normalization. So in that case, history was put aside.
But, and this is the pivot, this is where it all changes. That model of pragmatic reconciliation, it just collapses when you look at Beijing. The moment you ask China to put history aside, you're asking them to perform a feat of, political self-sabotage. No current leadership there could survive that.
And that's our mission today. We have to map out why China is the critical exception here. For the Beijing regime, historical hatred, this whole narrative around the century humiliation, it's not just emotional baggage. It's not an unfortunate chapter in a textbook.
No, it's a tool.
It is a finely honed, highly essential political tool. It provides the internal legitimacy they need to maintain unity, and it acts as their ultimate external diplomatic lever. To ask them to dismantle that it's like asking them to dismantle their core justification for ruling.
Okay, that clarifies the stakes dramatically. It's not about forgiveness, it's about power and survival. So, Sip and Talkers, here's our structure for today. We'll start with the survival guide, right? Singapore's strategy for navigating the giant stability and this fierce independence. Second, we're going to dive deep into that structural logic, what we're calling the no turning back policy, that basically locks China into this hostility.
And third, the critical analysis. We've identified 5 structural scenarios, 5 variables, where China might actually be forced to abandon that hostility and reverse course.
Right.
So we're really connecting the dots today between, domestic political stability, the hyper-specific demands of modern military strategy, and the global economics of competition. We want you to walk away understanding not just what China's doing, but why it feels compelled to do it.
And what actual pressure points exist that could change that whole calculus.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with the perspective of the small state. Because Singapore's position in this whole U.S.-China competition, it offers just an incredible lesson in realpolitik. PM Wong pointed out that they constantly face this favorite question.
Ah, yes. The question.
The question. From almost every Western journalist or visiting diplomat, are you going to choose the U.S. or China?
And their answer is just a masterclass in diplomacy and national prioritization. It's simple. Singapore doesn't have to choose.
They just refuse to play the game.
They refuse to frame their policy through that kind of ideological lens of alignment. Their policy is driven purely by calculated national interest. It's about maximizing prosperity, minimizing risk, not by aligning against one power or the other.
I find their terminology for this so interesting. They describe their strategy as multiple aligned, not non-aligned. What's the critical distinction there?
Oh, it's fundamental. Non-aligned, historically it implied a distance, a refusal to engage deeply with either bloc. You can almost call it strategic isolation.
Right, staying out of it.
Multiple aligned is the complete opposite.
Right.
It means fierce independence combined with active engagement with every major player, the U.S., China, Japan, India, Europe. They are constantly maintaining high-level contact, negotiating trade agreements, collaborating on security with everybody.
So it's a proactive risk management strategy. It's like if you're deeply interconnected with everyone, you keep all your options open, and you make sure you're never fully dependent on just one source.
Yeah.
Right.
Whether that's for security or critical components or just trade, it minimizes the risk of someone trying to coerce you.
Precisely. For a nation that's smaller than New York City, this intricate web of engagement is their primary defense mechanism. It's how they avoid becoming a pawn in a larger game. It lets them survive this intense competition, which, as they observe, is marked by high tension, but also a mutual desire to avoid, comprehensive decoupling or conflict.
Speaking of that tension, PM Wang used a great term to describe the high-level meetings between leaders, like the one recently between the presidents. He called it a temporary truce.
A truce, not a resolution. I love that phrasing. It's a temporary stabilization effort. Both Beijing and Washington, they understand the catastrophic global implications of total decoupling or a conflict.
Of course.
So these meetings, they serve a singular purpose, establishing guardrails. And these guardrails are just essential for managing the competition, making sure that some inevitable crisis or a minor misstep doesn't spiral into a full-blown confrontation. It's just managing the relationship so it doesn't fall off a cliff. Now, let's talk about the U.S. standing in the region, because Singapore's assessment is it's far from a cheerleading session.
No, not at all.
They acknowledge that U.S. leadership remains vital for global stability, even in a world that's shifting toward a multipolar order. But they pull no punches when they talk about recent American foreign policy actions.
They note explicitly that recent U.S. actions, specifically those driven by an America First sort of unilateralist style, have taken a hit. That's the quote. America's standing and reliability in Southeast Asia have taken a hit.
And this isn't just about rhetoric, right? It's about painful practical choices.
Yeah. Think about the practicalities of supply chains.
Yeah.
At Asian nations, they rely heavily on the U.S. for security guarantees and high-end tech, right?
Sure.
But they rely equally, if not more, on China for massive trade volume and economic growth. So when the U.S. imposes unilateral actions, like tariffs on certain products, or demands that allies completely restructure their supply chains, like tomorrow.
With no real alternative in place.
Right. Exactly. Often without providing stable alternatives or compensating for the massive economic costs. It forces these nations into an impossible bind. It makes the U.S. look unreliable. It suggests that Washington might prioritize its own domestic political shifts over long-term alliance stability.
It creates uncertainty, which is just kryptonite for any nation that depends on trade. And the most fascinating consequence of all this U.S. pressure, according to Singapore, is the unintended feedback loop it creates inside Beijing.
Yes, the paradoxical effect. The aggressive, high-pressure actions from the U.S. against China, especially on the technology front, they haven't led to Chinese compliance. Not at all. Instead, they've paradoxically strengthened China's resolve to accelerate its push for technology self-sufficiency.
It's the ultimate zero-sum reaction. You try to cut them off, and they just decide they're going to build their own wall, but faster.
That's the self-sufficiency loop. I mean, if Washington makes it clear that access to critical components, like advanced semiconductor chips, is a weapon that can be instantly deployed,
then Beijing sees any reliance as a vulnerability.
As an existential vulnerability. This fear dictates that they have to pour unlimited resources into domestic production, regardless of cost or short-term inefficiency. This hardened mindset was captured perfectly by a Chinese commentator who told PM Wang, "Nothing can stop China, only China can stop China."
Wow.
So the external pressure is just reinforcing the internal resolve to never back down. And that sets the stage for the structural trap we have to explore next.
Okay. So we've established that small states can afford to be flexible. I mean, they have to be for survival. Now we've got to confront the structural rigidity of a great power like China. Lawrence Wang's call to put history aside is, as you said, impossible. Because for Beijing, hostility isn't really a choice.
It's a structural necessity. It's derived from their internal political demands and their external military doctrine.
Okay, let's unpack the 4 structural columns that are holding this whole thing in place. Where does the regime's legitimacy even come from now that the golden age of, 10% annual GDP growth is over?
That brings us to the first and I think the most critical column, nationalism as the legitimizing pillar. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, it rested on 2 pillars, sustained high economic growth and demonstrating, effective, pragmatic governance.
And those are crumbling.
Those pillars are crumbling. We're seeing major structural issues, the ongoing housing crisis, which is trillions of dollars in lost household wealth, crushing debt at the provincial level, and critically, youth unemployment that is officially acknowledged to be devastatingly high. It probably exceeds 30% in urban areas.
So when the economy fails to deliver the promised prosperity, people need another reason to accept the political structure they're living under.
Absolutely. The CCP has shifted almost entirely to relying on this relentless externalized nationalism and the promise of national revival. That's what's replacing the failing economic legitimacy. The narrative is powerful. Well, the CCP positions itself as the sole political entity capable of defending the nation against external pressure and finally restoring the lost glory that was supposedly stolen during the century of humiliation.
Which is roughly 1839 to 1949 for anyone keeping score.
Right. So the contract with the people basically changed from we give you wealth to we protect you from enemies and we restore your honor.
And that's the nationalist narrative trap. If you abandon that narrative, if you suddenly declare that the humiliation is over and America is a friend and, we don't need to unify with Taiwan, you would instantly destabilize the regime's core claim to rule.
You'd be admitting you no longer need to protect the nation from the external bogeyman, which is now their main engine of political cohesion.
And once you start relying on that engine, you have to make sure every single citizen buys into the narrative. Which brings us to the second structural point, the deep entrenchment of hatred narratives. This isn't just about speeches, it's systemic.
It's a decades-long institutional project. This hostility isn't an accident. It's engineered. Hatred is fully institutionalized through every part of the state apparatus. The school curriculum, state media, movies, government-controlled history, education.
Right.
For example, the comprehensive state-mandated anti-Japanese education that began in the 1990s. And it was aimed at cultivating this very specific victim-reviver identity. The nation as a historical victim, and the CCP as its inevitable reviver and defender.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that plays out in, say, the school curriculum?
The emphasis is just relentless on specific historical grievances. The atrocities of the Nanjing Massacre, the unequal treaties imposed by Western powers, the constant reminder that the nation was geographically dismembered. Every history class, every state museum tour, it reinforces this idea that the great powers are inherently suppressive and that China is inherently just.
So after 30 years of this kind of sustained ideological bombardment, that narrative becomes what you called an irreversible national DNA.
It does, and that DNA creates a gigantic backlash risk for the state itself.
How so?
In a highly mobilized society, where decades of education have been spent convincing people that Taiwan unification is a sacred mission and external powers are constantly plotting containment, the risk of stopping that narrative is actually greater than the risk of continuing it.
So they're afraid of their own creation.
Absolutely. If the CCP suddenly announced a soft retreat, say, agreeing to a long-term status quo on Taiwan, the populace, which is steeped in this nationalist fervor, might see it as a failure, a betrayal, a weakness. They'd question the credibility of the entire party history. The nationalist beast they fed is now too big to contradict.
That makes the internal situation a near-perfect political trap. Okay, let's look at the external rigidity, which touches on the third structural reason, strategic depth. This is where ideology meets hard military reality. Taiwan and the South China Sea, they're not just political symbols.
No, they're core requirements for China's great power security architecture. It's a zero-sum reality. If China is going to truly become a global superpower that can project force globally, it has to first address its geographical constraints.
Let's look at Taiwan first. What does Taiwan strategically provide for them?
Control of Taiwan is essential because its current position on what's called the first island chain.
That string of islands running from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines.
Right. That means China is perpetually bottled up. Essentially, if Beijing doesn't control Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, is constrained to operate only in shallow, easily monitored coastal waters. Taiwan acts as a massive military plug, preventing China from accessing the deep Pacific and projecting power globally.
So the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines are basically pinning China inside its own territorial waters. They can't get out of the house to get on the ocean highway.
That's a perfect analogy. And the South China Sea is even more vital for China's long-term survival strategy, specifically its nuclear deterrent capability.
Okay, this is a complex technical point, so we need to break this down really clearly. Why is the SCS so critical for its nuclear submarines?
China's nuclear arsenal relies on a concept called second strike capability. This is the ability to absorb a devastating first nuclear attack from an adversary, say the U.S., and still have hidden, survivable nuclear assets that are capable of launching a massive retaliatory strike.
And that deterrent is what prevents the first attack in the first place.
Exactly. And where does the SCS come in? These crucial, survivable assets are housed in China's nuclear submarine fleet. They're SSBNs. To be survivable, SSBNs need to hide in deep, vast, and acoustically complex waters where they can't be constantly monitored by the sophisticated sensor networks of U.S. and allied forces.
And the East China Sea is too shallow.
It's relatively shallow and heavily monitored. The South China Sea, because of its immense depth and complex topography, provides the ideal secrecy and refuge needed for these nuclear deterrent submarines to operate completely undetected.
Wow. So abandoning their sovereignty claims in the SCS or allowing foreign monitoring there, that's viewed by Beijing as compromising the core security of their entire nuclear deterrent.
Exactly. It shifts the whole calculus from a diplomatic dispute to an existential security concern. So from Beijing's perspective, giving up these claims is not a diplomatic concession. It's abandoning the long-term foundational security of the nation. The logic is strictly zero-sum. Control of the SCS is mandatory for survival as a great power. They cannot give it up.
And finally, we connect this back to the external dynamic, the fourth structural reason, the vicious cycle of U.S. competition.
As we mentioned, Beijing now frames this whole geopolitical competition as way more than just a dispute over trade balances. They see it as a civilizational and survival contest, a new Western containment aimed at preventing China's rightful rise. They explicitly link every U.S. action, the tech bans, the diplomatic pressure, the strategic encirclement by alliances, they link it all back to the historical humiliations of the past.
And that framing is insidious because it means any compromise, any concession is immediately framed internally as weakness.
Precisely. Any retreat, any major policy compromise, any sign of giving ground would be interpreted internally as the failure of the CCP to resist external pressure. And this would be politically devastating. It would feed the very insecurity and crisis of legitimacy that nationalism is currently propping up. So the structural logic is self-reinforcing. Hostility is required to maintain internal control and external security. And this creates that no turning back reality.
Okay, Sunny, so we spent a lot of time establishing that China is, for all these reasons, structurally locked into hostility. That means Lawrence Wong's plea, noble as it is politically impossible under the current conditions. But history is rarely permanent.
Right.
So what kind of seismic shifts, what level of pain or change would actually force Beijing to pivot away from this aggressive nationalistic path? We're looking for the 5 key variables, the cost thresholds that could crack this structure.
This section is so crucial. Because despite the seemingly monolithic nature of the CCP's current strategy, history shows that survival trumps ideology every single time. These 5 variables are the high-impact, low-probability events that would force a strategic reversal. So let's start with the one that breaks most regimes, the economy.
Variable 1, internal economic collapse.
Yes, and this is the scenario where the economic crisis becomes so profound that it threatens systemic political stability. It moves beyond a mere recession into social disintegration. We're not talking about 5% GDP growth versus 3%. We're talking about a complete failure of the domestic financial system.
Okay, so what does that systemic failure actually look like in a Chinese context, given the high degree of state control?
It involves the simultaneous failure of several major components.
Right.
First, the widespread collapse of what are called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs.
Right, the off-balance sheet things cities use to borrow money.
Exactly. There are currently trillions of dollars in debt. Their failure would bankrupt entire municipal governments, leading to immediate public service cuts and, social unrest.
So the local governments can't pay the police or keep the power on anymore.
Exactly. Second, the shadow banking crisis, this massive unregulated lending, it reaches a tipping point. It triggers widespread bank runs and the loss of savings for millions of ordinary households. When people lose their life savings and their homes, the legitimacy crisis becomes terminal. When millions of highly educated young people suffering from 30% plus unemployment see no future, the entire social contract just breaks down.
So in that catastrophic scenario, how does the regime pivot?
The mechanism is a forced, urgent shift to what you could call livelihood revival. The leaders, focused solely on staving off a revolution, would be compelled to adopt a strategic retreat.
What does that mean in practice?
It means immediately slashing expensive external projects, reducing the massive military budget, pulling back on global debt traps like the Belt and Road Initiative, and prioritizing regaining international economic access. They would desperately need foreign capital, trade access, and stable supply chains just to restart the domestic engine. This would necessitate a massive, dramatic, diplomatic thaw with the West to save the system.
It's essentially the painful realization that you can't conquer the world if your own house is on fire. It kind of mirrors Deng Xiaoping's realization in the 80s, right? That economic growth had to take precedence over ideological purity.
But on a much larger, much more desperate scale, yeah.
Okay, let's move to variable 2. Core leadership and ideological turnaround.
This one addresses the ideological rigidity we talked about. It would require a fundamental shift in the ruling elite, so likely a post-Xi era where the new leadership prioritizes genuine economic governance and pragmatism over the current expansionist ideological narratives.
So a new leader comes in and essentially tries to undo the last decade of political centralization and nationalism. I mean, that sounds like a recipe for a civil war within the party.
It is the highest political risk. This shift requires the ascendance of a genuinely pragmatic faction that's willing to sacrifice the nationalist rhetoric for long-term stability. The core change would be the redefinition of the Great Revival. Instead of defining it as territorial unification and global dominance, the new leadership would need to redefine it as achieving high-quality internal development and global contribution.
So instead of conquering Taiwan, they focus on, I don't know, conquering climate change or high-tech manufacturing excellence for the global good?
Precisely. If they can successfully redefine winning as being respected and prosperous internally, they can de-escalate the external hostility without admitting defeat. We see historical parallels to this.
Yeah.
Gorbachev's new thinking in the late Soviet era was an acknowledgement that the system just could not afford the ideological pursuit of global dominance anymore.
Yeah.
For Beijing, the pragmatic realization would be ideological purity is bankrupting our ability to govern effectively. But as you said, successfully dismantling the institutionalized hatred and the centralized power structure is incredibly challenging and would risk unleashing total internal political chaos.
Okay, so if the internal structure is nationalism, the external structure is military security. Let's talk about variable 3. Unbearable cost of expansion or a military defeat. What level of external military punishment would force a change in strategy?
This is the high-stakes kinetic scenario. China would be forced to retreat if a military misadventure like a failed Taiwan blockade, a large-scale aggression in the South China Sea, results in significant unrecoverable losses.
And this would require a unified, decisive, coordinated military intervention by key allies, right? Primarily the U.S. and Japan.
Yes. We're talking about a genuine strategic defeat, not a skirmish. And when we say unrecoverable losses, the threshold is the destruction or disabling of large segments of China's most modern naval and air assets. For example, losing their newest aircraft carriers, key landing ships, or significant portions of their submarine fleet. A decisive defeat like that would just shatter the domestic confidence in the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
Why is that domestic military confidence so important to the regime?
Because the CCP's whole promise to the nation is that they are the only entity capable of restoring national glory and defending the homeland. If the PLA is publicly humiliated or defeated in the pursuit of a core national objective like Taiwan, it would collapse that pillar of legitimacy. It would force a long-term delay of unification and a massive internal strategic focus on modernization and peaceful means, just to avoid catastrophic internal instability.
So the geopolitical trigger here is the deterrence factor. It's making the cost of aggression prohibitively high.
It's deterrence through unity. Singapore's observations highlighted the growing importance of a rock-solid alliance, specifically mentioning the U.S., Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. If this regional security architecture becomes unified, robust, and militarily interoperable, the cost-benefit analysis for Beijing completely shifts. The regime would have to conclude that continuing the aggressive expansion is an unacceptable threat to its own long-term survival.
Okay, variable 4. total technology and economic strangulation. We established that current U.S. tech actions are paradoxically strengthening China's resolve for self-sufficiency. So for this variable to work, that self-sufficiency loop has to fail completely.
Right. It has to force a retreat back to reliance on the West. This variable requires sustained, effective, and broad technological strangulation. The throttling has to be so complete that it cripples China's capacity for innovation and stunts its ability to maintain its military modernization pace for an extended period, like a decade. The promised economic self-reliance has to be proven to be an ideological fantasy.
So why is that self-sufficiency loop so hard for Beijing to close on their own?
Because advanced technology, especially cutting-edge AI and logic chips, it relies on a globally interconnected ecosystem that China just cannot replicate overnight, even with unlimited funding. It's not just about designing chips, it's about the hyper-specialized manufacturing equipment, the specific intellectual property, and the vast global supply chains for all the inputs.
The EUV machines from the Netherlands, for example.
Exactly. If the U.S. and key allies like the Netherlands and Japan maintain the tight export controls on this highly complex machinery, China will eventually hit a wall where their domestic chips are a decade or more behind the global curve. And that would fundamentally limit their long-term economic and military potential.
And if that strangulation actually succeeds, what's the internal consequence?
The pragmatic faction would gain undeniable leverage. They could argue, we must drop the aggressive posture immediately to access the critical technology required to sustain our modernization and growth. This would necessitate a comprehensive strategic détente with the West. It would be a forced pragmatic reversal because the cost of maintaining hostility technological stagnation is just too high for a state that's committed to modernization.
Okay, finally, variable 5. A long-term societal generational shift. This is the slowest, most unpredictable factor, right? A 20 to 40-year timeline.
Yes, but it addresses the core issue of that national DNA. Yeah. We're talking about a fundamental cultural drift. We're looking at the emerging generations. If they start to prioritize personal aspiration, quality of life, and social freedom over the state-mandated nationalist narrative, the system loses its internal fuel.
We already see little signs of this with cultural movements like the lying flat movement, right? This passive resistance against the relentless high-pressure demands of the state and the economy.
Exactly. So instead of being motivated by the humiliation narrative, they start asking, why do I have to sacrifice my job prospects and my housing affordability for a territorial claim that doesn't impact my daily life?
All right.
The effect of this generational cultural drift would be the slow but steady erosion of the regime's main tool, the external enemy narrative. If people just stop caring about the propaganda, the state is forced to adapt its legitimacy model. It has to shift its focus from geopolitical expansion to domestic satisfaction. While the current controlled information environment makes this a very long shot, this shift is ultimately a powerful, slow-moving force for change.
So, to synthesize this high-stakes section, China is locked in, but the key to unlocking the hostility is either a catastrophic failure, economic, military, or tech, or a complete ideological and leadership restructuring. Anything short of that, and the hostility just continues.
The structure dictates the course, until the cost of the course becomes systemically unsustainable.
Okay, let's broaden the lens now and integrate the rest of Singapore's keen observations, because they help contextualize the dangers facing all nations, large and small, and we have to address the reddest of red lines, Taiwan.
For Singapore, maintaining stability is everything, so their assessment of the Taiwan Strait risk is very sober. The Prime Minister noted that Singapore currently assesses the risk of China taking unilateral, unprovoked action leading to war as unlikely in the foreseeable future.
They don't think Beijing is rushing headlong toward conflict right now.
They don't. And that's a significant assessment coming from a nation so close to the flashpoint. But if they see the risk as manageable for now, what is the key variable keeping the peace?
What's holding it all together?
The key, they argue, rests entirely on the U.S. consistently maintaining the carefully crafted One China policy. This policy is a decades-long diplomatic tightrope walk, deliberately ambiguous, that must not be disrupted.
Okay, can we break down the 3 parts of that tightrope walk for everyone?
Certainly. First, the U.S. acknowledges the Beijing position that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of it. Second, the U.S. maintains the status quo, so no unilateral moves by either side to change the situation. No declaration of independence by Taiwan, no unprovoked invasion by Beijing.
And the third part is critical.
And third, critically, the U.S. supports Taiwan's self-defense capability under the Taiwan Relations Act.
So The moment the U.S. deviates from that carefully managed ambiguity, say, by implying full diplomatic recognition of Taiwan or reducing Taiwan's defense support, the risk profile changes dramatically. It could potentially force Beijing's hand.
Exactly. Singapore views U.S. consistency and adherence to that balance as the main guarantor of peace. Any deviation sends a catastrophic signal to Beijing that the status quo is changing against them, which would validate their fears of containment and potentially accelerate a military timeline. The current path of hostility and external assertion is mandated by an internal political necessity, that nationalism replacing economic legitimacy and hard external security demands, specifically securing their nuclear deterrent via the South China Sea.
And we've established that the no-turning-back structural logic means that Lawrence Wang's plea to put history aside is, for now, impossible. Reversal only happens if there is a catastrophic failure, economic implosion, strategic military defeat, total technological strangulation, or a fundamental high-risk restructuring of the party's ideology and leadership.
This analysis, we hope, has given you a real-world granular understanding of the structural forces driving global geopolitics. Our role here is just to impartially report on the structural realities of Beijing's political existence, helping you form your own independent conclusions about the costs and probabilities of future geopolitical shifts.
Right. Structures and incentives, they often dictate behavior more than the personal desires of any single leader.
Absolutely.
And that leads us back to the image we started with. The fear of that Michigan ghost town driving Singapore's political leaders to prioritize resilience and pragmatic survival through multiple alignment. So here's our final provocative thought for you to mull over. China is committed to historical revenge and ideological expansion, which locks it into constant confrontation with the world. Does this commitment to historical grievance ultimately make it less adaptable and thus, in the long run, less resilient than a small nation like Singapore, whose survival strategy is focused purely on radical, forward-looking pragmatism and adaptation?
The ability to set aside history and prioritize dynamic adaptation might, in the end, prove to be a greater source of strength and longevity than the pursuit of centuries-old grievances. That's a powerful question for the coming decades.
This has been a heavy but necessary conversation, really digging into what truly drives the world's most critical relationship. Thank you for synthesizing all this complex material for us.
Thank you for joining us for this crucial discussion. We hope this has given you the knowledge you need to be well-informed on this critical topic.
If you enjoyed this analysis, please make sure you subscribe to Sip&Talk wherever you get your audio. Your support helps us keep bringing you these detailed, deep dives. And also check out our old friend Mickey's YT channel, Mickytolife. He's got some really fun memes and travel vlogs.
You'll have a good time. We'll see you next time.